So I'm going to tell you a little story, and I like U.S. revenues in addition to my stampless folded letters from the 1780s to 1850s. I like the 3-cent 51s and plating, but I also love the revenues. And here is a nice little U.S. proprietary medicine stamp. During that period around the Civil War, when the government needed to generate some revenue to support the war effort. That there was, the tax law was enacted and passed in 1862 to help pay for the North and increasing debt. And all these taxes were directed at matches, canned fruit, patent medicines, perfumes, and playing cards. And so, that's really the tax. And so all of these various proprietors who had all of these various medicines, canned fruit, matches, that they went out there and they created their own stamps. They're called, private Die Proprietary stamps. We're going to talk more about this, I think in the spring at one of our sessions. But why I brought this up is, as we're going through our stamps, and I get a little bit of time to go through my stamps, but this thing sort of popped up and it just didn't seem right. And I did a little investigating. But at the time, and this is the medicine, these were on various proprietary medicines. And these stamps were not just stamps and paid the revenue. These were also advertising for these various entrepreneurs and business people, because they had to put this stamp and all of these other stamps on the actual package. This was on a bottle. This was on the top of a bottle. You could see here on the stamp, and I'll go into detail, that this was on a bottle and the edges wrapped around and sealed it, and you ripped the stamp when you purchased the product and you opened up the bottle in this case. But that's how these were used. So they were used a couple of different ways. And they were printed around the time when, the Carpenter, Butler and Carpenter were doing engraving and printing, just like they were doing for the U.S. government stamps. They were doing National Banknote Company, American Banknote Company, even the BEP. Over these years, 30 years or so of these being in use, if not longer, a lot of different printers. And with a lot of different printers, it meant there was a lot of different papers. And so they used all sorts of different paper. We call them old paper and silk paper and all of that. And I think everybody's familiar with that. And what I'm going to tell you today is what's not so common and what you rarely come across is what's called experimental silk paper. And I'm just going to tell you a little brief history, and then we're going to go through. So let's see if I could advance the slide. So here we go. So here is this company called the United States Proprietary Medicine Company, a doctor, quote unquote doctor, C.W. Roback from Cincinnati, Ohio, introduced a group of proprietary medicines in 1855. He designated them as Scandinavian, an odd spelling in 1857, but later he changed the name to Scandinavian, and he applied it to his blood pills and his blood purifier. I wish I knew what the ingredients were, but I don't. But very interesting medicines were put out during that time. And by 1866, then some Scandinavian stomach bitters had made their appearance. And, I like bitters in my gin and tonic. I'm not sure that I want to drink a bottle of this Scandinavian stomach bitters, but there was a lot of different proprietary medicines out there at the time for a lot of different maladies during this period. And again, like I said earlier, they needed stamps to pay the revenue because the government was charging to try to, fund the efforts. And in 1866, this company called U.S. Proprietary Medicine, also in Cincinnati, took over the business. And this Dr. Roback is listed in the city directory as a manufacturer of fine cut and smoking tobacco. But we do know that they issued stamps. And here are two proofs. I'm just showing you proofs. I'm not showing you actual stamps, but I will show you after the stamps that I have of the two different stamps. One was a 6-cent stamp that was issued first, and it's called RS. If you look in your Scott catalog, there's a whole section in the back after the revenues, in the revenue section for matching medicines, as we call them. This was issued in 1867, and it was used on the stomach bitters. And these were all issued on old paper, and I'll show you that later. And then shortly thereafter, they issued their blood purifier. And this stamp, a 4-cent stamp, was then issued to pay the tax on the blood purifier and was actually on the top of the bottle cap. And the side flaps went over, and these were gummed and they were adhered. And when the person bought it, they bought it. It was the 4-cent tax, and they ripped open the stamp. So a lot of these are not as nice. They are ripped and torn and shredded and thin, but to find really nice copies, as those match medicine collectors out there know, takes a lot of looking. And some are not as common as others, and some are quite rare. And this was issued for a number of years, from 1867 to 75. A batch of 192,000 were printed on old paper, and only about 38,000 were printed on silk paper. And if you collect revenues and you know revenues, you've seen silk paper, because these fibers are very, very prominent. They're very long. They're all over the back and front of the stamp. But for the purposes of this discussion, some were printed on what we call experimental silk paper. Very small amounts where very small numbers were, and these were completely different than the traditional silk paper. This was silk thread that were very small and minute and tiny, and fractions of millimeters or millimeters, and they were very thin and straight. They were almost always red. Every once in a while, almost always blue. Very rarely will you see a red. Some people will argue that the red is really not truly part of that, but some detritus, if you will. But the fine blue threads are scattered throughout the paper, and sometimes you'll only see one fiber. That's just how this experimental silk paper was made and used by the early Butler and Carpenter who did this printing. So here is now enlargement, I hope you can see that, of this. Really, it's a pretty stamp. Again, it was advertising, and it was paying a tax. And you'll see the labels on the left and right: United States Proprietary Medicine Company, Cincinnati, Ohio. On the right is the U.S. Internal Revenue 4-cent stamp with 2 4s. Just beautiful engraving, and there are some that are even more engraved than this. This is just a fairly nice example, printed by Butler and Carpenter, 1867. You'll see the building in the middle, a 5-story. You'll see a nice street scene, a sidewalk, and 2 men on horseback. Again, their building in Cincinnati. Some did more advertising than others, but this would have been on the top of the bottle cap. I hope you can see my mouse moving. You can see that? Because I'm moving it. If you can see it. So I don't know if you can see the hand. It's moving on my screen. But if you look in the middle of the stamp on the back, below the reverse, you can see what looks like a circular stain, and even a little bit of a tear here at the lower middle. This was used on the top of a bottle of this bottle of bitters, and it was gummed and attached. That's why there's a little bit of a stain left. And both of the right and left flaps were folded over on to the side of the bottle. And this is not a small stamp. This is 105 by 21 millimeters, so it's a pretty good size stamp. And I described at first glance when I looked at this in my collection, I had it as an old paper. It's old whitish background. It doesn't have silk fibers. It is not watermarked. For a number of years on other stamps, they used watermark, but this was not known on watermark. It was either old paper or it was silk. And so I pulled it out and I looked at it again, and I got my 30X and I did some high resolution scans. And what I actually found when I really got close, and I blew it up here so you could see it. If you look close here next to the design, you see 2 very small blue fibers, straight, thin, very tiny. You could see the stamp here, and I've highlighted it. And then when I kept going across and looking, I got to the R in revenue. And if you look down here in the R at the bottom, you could see inside the R is another blue fiber. If you then go to the top and you look to the left of the building, I have a blue circle. I point up to the top, you could see a blue fiber. You even see some reds. And so, I color-coded it red. Below Medicine in Cincinnati is a thin, straight red fiber next to the D. And above the S is actually an interesting curled fiber. I'm not sure that is part of it. It doesn't rub off. Most of these fibers are within the fiber of the paper themselves. They're not surface fibers. If you, were to soak it or rub your finger or a light brush on it, if it was on the surface, it would rub off. These particular silk fibers are absolutely embedded with the pulp of the paper, which what really helps you confirm that this is experimental silk paper. You normally only see these on the reverse, but in this case, it's on the front. Here is the reverse, just to confirm that, again, peppered very randomly throughout, very short, thin blue fibers if you look from left to right, even a couple of red. And so really, I just remind folks again, too, when you're looking at any of your stamps, when you're looking for double transfers, whether you're looking for paper types, whether you're looking for an interesting cancel, whether you're looking for something on the back or the front, just really take a good look, because you might be surprised of what you find. A $10 or $20 stamp can become, a $300, $400, $500 stamp. And then also add to the value of your collection, what you have. If you're looking to collect the different paper types, you now have added to your paper types. It just, again, always reminds me to have some, utilize the technology that's in front of you, whether it's your 30X loop, or you just put it on your flatbed scanner and get a high-res 2400 DPI. You'd be surprised what you find. So while we have time to look through our collections, I recommend it. So in summary, and of course I'm showing a wrapper, again, just this is again a summary. I just told you a little bit about Roback and what he introduced. He had proprietary medicines, these blood pills and blood purifier. I showed you the stamps that were used on the bottles, but they also had pills. And so they issued these beautiful wrappers, and there's an example of a wrapper. It is greatly reduced. Sorry for the typo. That wrapper is a bit larger than what I'm showing you on the screen, because they would wrap the pills inside of it and seal it. You could see the wax at the top and the bottom that they used to seal it, those two stains. This was used. It has the creases where they would put the box of pills inside of this wrapper, wrap it and seal it, and you would sell it that way, and that would pay the tax. And that was 1 cent for this box of pills. So I'm just showing you again other types of proprietary medicines. This company issued 2 different types, wrappers and stamps. But what I showed you here again is that they issued the 2, and experimental silk paper is out there. If you look closely, I just again remind you to do that and look for these minute fibers. What I probably should have shown is what a normal silk paper stamp looks like. But if anybody has a revenue and you've looked at them from that, 4th issue period afterwards, what these are a lot of silk fibers. These, as I showed, are not a lot. These are very few and far between, and are very short and small. And on smaller stamps, like I said, you only might see 1 or 2 fibers. This happens to be a larger stamp, so this particular stamp has a bit more of these silk fibers. So that's all I wanted to share with you. Just from those that like to do fly specking and look closely at what you have. There is a catalog designation for this, and it is given E. They got crazy and fancy. E is for experimental. So A was old paper, B was silk, C, I want to say was watermarked, and D was ultramarine. That's for the ink, and D was watermarked, and then E was for experimental silk paper. So that's all I wanted to share with you, and I can stop sharing for my little show and tell tonight, and thanks for the opportunity. I'll take
Charlie, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, of course.
The blue paper in the Washington Franklins, was that the same, was that experimental paper too?
That's not experimental silk paper. The Wash Franks that were blue back in the 1900s?
Yeah.
That is not experimental silk paper. Totally different paper.
It's just a blue paper. Okay.
That's just the blue. This was different, where they had an interesting stock of.
I think it had different rag content.
Yeah, so totally different than this.
Okay.
This is 1860s. That is 19 teens, right? And that's a different period, different printers. That was what BEP, et cetera, et cetera. So I know there's others that can probably speak to the bluish paper on the Wash Franks, but that is not the paper that we're talking about here. Totally different type and style and production methodology, at least from what was done here with experimental silk. So, but thanks for the question, Dennis. I appreciate it. Any other questions on this?
Hey, Charlie.
It's Tom. Please. Hey, Tom.
Your blood purifiers back in the early 1800s, or garlic, dried vegetables, blueberry, cranberries.
There you go.
And usually like different vegetables that were dried.
Yes.
And they called it a purifier because the garlic would act, as you know, to lower your blood pressure, and people felt better.
Yes, that's exactly.
Lower blood pressure.
That is right, and that's really the component. So the good thing is, and I said I don't know the actual composition of this. Actually, there's some really good reference books out there that have been done that actually do know the composition of most of these interesting medicines that were out there, quote unquote, offered. And you're right, they had some stuff that
I did a lot of research way back in the day at college on that kind of material, but.
Well, that's good to know. So we're doing okay if we continue to have garlic. Is that what you're saying? I should add more garlic to my pasta and my red sauce? That's what I should add to?
That's one way of keeping social distance.
That well, well, you know, I am in a Sicilian family. We
mandatory.
use a lot of garlic in our cooking, so clearly everybody stays away from me. So
That makes
thank you,
distancing
Tom.
mandatory.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions on that though? I just wanted to put a. I wanted to put a. Okay.
They also used a lot of alcohol
Yes.
and
Yes.
a lot of poppies,
Yep.
Okay.
other kinds of illegal substances.
They
that's
did.
Part of what made these things better.
Well, it is. All of these elixirs had components in it that today, you know, yeah, are controlled in a completely different way. Remember, there's no FDA and no Food and Drug, and anybody could put together a little composition and kind of get it out there. And if they paid the revenue and the tax during this period, they were okay to put that out there, as we know. And so it's just a fascinating area to study the proprietary medicines of this period. There were hundreds of proprietors that were out there during this period. I mean, I like the matches and I like the perfumes and collecting them and researching and studying them. But the medicines is a really intriguing area if anybody's interested in. I know I'm going to put together a presentation, I guess, in the spring to give you an overview of private dyes and matcha medicines and all that stuff. So I'll save it till then. But I just wanted to remind everybody, you know, that looking closely at what you have sometimes pays off. You'd be surprised what's been lurking in your stock books or your albums. And finding one of these nice little stamps was good for me in the early mornings when I had a few minutes to look at it. So thanks for letting me share.